It is the tallest tree in the eastern half of the continent. It grows in nearly every state east of the Mississippi. In city parks, along the interstate, in the woods behind the house where you grew up. You have walked past it thousands of times, and you have almost certainly never been told that its soft green needles carry more vitamin C, ounce for ounce, than the orange sitting in your refrigerator. That its inner bark once kept entire nations alive through winters that starved everything else. Or that cutting one of these trees, standing on your own land, could get you hauled into a courtroom by the King of England. At least, that is all most people see now. A tree. This is the eastern white pine, and for 200 years it was one of the most fought-over living things on the continent. Welcome to Nature's Lost Vault. Northeastern North America, 10,000 years before the first sawmill. White pine grew from Newfoundland down to Georgia and west toward the Great Lakes, in stands so vast that early surveyors described riding under a single unbroken green canopy for days. You can recognize it in about 2 seconds, once you know the trick. The needles grow in soft bundles, and there are always 5 of them to a bundle. 5 letters in the word white, 5 needles in the hand. No other pine in the eastern forest does that. The needles are long, thin, and flexible, a pale blue-green, and they hold their color straight through the snow. That detail, that the tree stays green and alive while the rest of the forest goes bare and brown, is the entire reason it mattered so much to the people who lived here first. Because in the dead of a northern winter, before refrigeration, before a grocery store could fly oranges up from Florida, fresh food simply did not exist. There was no fruit, no vegetables, nothing green on a plate for months. And without vitamin C, the human body physically comes apart. It is called scurvy. Your gums soften and bleed, old wounds split back open, your teeth loosen and fall out, and eventually your heart gives up. For most of human history, it was one of the great killers of anyone trapped through a long winter or a long sea voyage. The Haudenosaunee, the people we often call the Iroquois, had already solved it. They knew that the needles and inner bark of the evergreens around them, simmered into a hot tea, would hold that sickness off all winter long. Think about that for a second. They had worked out the answer to a vitamin deficiency centuries before anyone in Europe knew vitamins existed. The most famous proof came in the winter of 1535, when the French explorer Jacques Cartier and his crew were frozen into the ice along the St. Lawrence River, and scurvy tore through them. Of 110 men, 25 were already dead, and Cartier himself was failing, when the local people showed them how to boil the bark and needles of an evergreen they called anedda, the tree of life. The men who drank it recovered within days. Here is the detail most retellings skip. Historians still argue over exactly which evergreen anedda was. The leading candidate is the white cedar, and the white pine sits right there among the contenders. But the argument almost does not matter, because every one of those trees works for the same reason. The needles are loaded with vitamin C, and the white pine carries a remarkable amount of it. The United States Forest Service measured the ascorbic acid in eastern white pine needles and found between roughly 3/4 of a milligram and nearly 2 milligrams in every gram, with the older needles holding the most. An orange, gram for gram, carries about 1/2 milligram. So ounce for ounce, the needles on the tree in your yard can hold as much as 3 times the vitamin C of the fruit we are all told to eat for it. A handful of them, chopped and steeped in hot water, makes a pale, faintly citrus tea. It is free. It is there in the dead of January. And for the people who knew the trick, it was the difference between walking into spring and not. The needles were only the beginning. Peel back the rough outer bark of a white pine, and you reach a thin, pale, living layer called the cambium. It is faintly sweet, and it is food. Real food, with starch and sugar and calories in it. You can chew it straight off the tree, cut it into strips and boil it soft, or dry it and grind it into a rough flour for bread. Across the northern forests, when the hunting failed and the winter stores ran empty, that inner bark is what stood between a family and starvation. Almost nobody remembers where the Adirondack Mountains got their name. It comes from a Mohawk word, written down by a French missionary back in 1724, that translates roughly to the tree eaters. It was not a compliment. The Mohawk used it for their Algonquin neighbors, the people who would strip and eat the inner bark of the white pine to survive the hardest winters. The Algonquin eventually moved on. The name stuck to the mountains, and today it rides on license plates and lawn chairs, and almost no one remembers it began as a description of eating this exact tree to stay alive. One caution, and it is worth saying plainly. The white pine is the safe one, the five-needle pine, the best tasting of them all. But a few evergreens are genuinely poisonous. Never eat from a yew, and stay clear of the Norfolk Island pine and the ponderosa. Learn the five needles, and you will not go wrong. By the time European settlers understood what this tree could feed and heal, someone far more powerful had noticed something different about it. And this is where the white pine stopped being a quiet source of medicine and food, and became something a king was willing to fight a colony over. The problem was the Royal Navy. By the late 1600s, England had cut down almost all of its own tall timber, and a warship of the line was hungry for masts. The single tallest, straightest, strongest spar a shipbuilder could dream of. Europe could not grow one anymore. But the American white pine rose as high as 250 feet, with a trunk 6 or 7 feet across at the base. Arrow straight, light, and strong enough to carry sail for 20 years. British naval officers took one look and understood. Whoever controlled these trees controlled the sea, so the Crown simply claimed them. Starting in 1691, a clause written into the Massachusetts Charter reserved every white pine 24 inches or more across for the king. Then, in 1722, Parliament tightened it. Now any white pine 12 inches thick was the king's property, on public land or private, and a colonist needed a royal license and a fee just to cut a tree growing in his own woods. Officials called the surveyors of the king's woods rode the forests and cut 3 hatchet strokes shaped like an arrow into the chosen trunks. The king's broad arrow. Once that mark was in the bark, the tree belonged to the navy, and touching it was a crime. Think about how that lands on a settler. You clear your land by hand, you hold the deed, and there is a 200-foot pine standing on it that you are forbidden to touch, all because 3 axe marks say it belongs to a king across an ocean. They even ruled that owning a floorboard wider than about 2 feet was evidence you had stolen one of the king's trees. Watch what the colonists did next, because it tells you everything. They cut the marked trees anyway. They chopped the arrow out of the bark, or burned the trees so they were useless as masts but fine as lumber, or slapped the king's mark onto worthless trees to send the surveyors chasing shadows. The British called the whole simmering mess the White Pine War. New England shipped more than 4,500 of these masts across the Atlantic, but one royal surveyor estimated that out of every 500 trees marked for the king, just one ever reached England. If the crown had eased off there, this might be a footnote. It did not. Weir, New Hampshire. 1772. A new royal governor, John Wentworth, decided the law would finally be enforced and sent his deputy surveyor into the mill towns along the Piscataquag River. At the sawmills in Weir, the deputy found roughly 270 white pine logs, 17 to 36 inches across, and marked every one of them as the king's. The mill owners were fined. Most towns paid. Weir refused. On the 13th of April, the county sheriff, Benjamin Whiting, rode into town with a warrant and arrested a mill owner named Ebenezer Mudgett, then let him go on the promise he would pay in the morning. That night, word went around Weir, and the next morning, Mudgett came back. With more than 20 men behind him, their faces blackened with soot. They dragged the sheriff out of his bed at the inn and beat him across the back with rods. 1 lash, the story goes, for every log he had tried to take. They cut the mane and tail off his horse and ran him and his deputy out of town to jeers that followed them down the road. The court that fall fined the ringleaders 20 shillings each and let them walk. The judges, one of whom, Meshach Ware, would soon help write New Hampshire's constitution and become its first president, understood exactly why the men had done it. This was 20 months before anyone dumped tea into Boston Harbor, 3 years before the first shot at Lexington, and the tree at the center of it became a banner. The pine tree flag flew over the militiamen at Bunker Hill and over the first warships George Washington sent to sea. The evergreen the king had tried to own turned into the symbol of a people who refused to be owned. That is the strange arc of this tree. Revered as medicine, eaten to survive, fought over by an empire, flown on a flag of rebellion, and then, in the space of a few generations, forgotten, until it became just the green thing in the background of everyone's life. The white pines are still standing. They still push out fresh needles every spring, still carry the same vitamin C the Forest Service measured, still grow that sweet layer of bark beneath the surface. They still tower over the eastern woods the way they did when a surveyor first looked up and saw a warship's mast. Nothing about the tree changed. We simply stopped looking at it. So the next time you pass one, and you will, probably today, stop for a second. Count the needles. 5 to a bundle. And remember that the most ordinary tree on your street was once worth a rebellion. If this changed the way you see the trees on your own street, subscribe to Nature's Lost Vault. There is another one hiding in plain sight, and it opens soon.